Well, if you're visiting, we're second week in a series called Resisting Tame, where we're unpacking some disciplines, some areas in our life that need to be stronger than their counterpart if we're going to resist being tamed, resist becoming lukewarm in our faith. So let's kick off. When someone agrees to take a job, one of the most important parts of that process is to negotiate a salary. The person agrees to do a set of tasks, to take on a particular portion of work in exchange for a particular sum of money. And for every contracted hour that they work, they earn this portion of money, right? You clock in, you do your work, you clock out. And what you earn is in direct proportion to how much you work, right? That's called a salary. Well, there's another concept which is a level up from the idea of a salary, and it's the concept of rent. Now, I'm not talking about the money that you might pay a landlord. I'm referring to the economic concept of rent. It's the idea that you can earn an additional portion of money on top of your salary for no extra effort. Yeah? We're seriously too quiet. For example, if you were, say, to make shoes for a living, and your name happened to be Hugo Boss, do we know who Hugo Boss is? Good. Some nods. Then after you account for your raw materials, after you account for your salary, you're able to charge an economic premium. You're able to charge an excess on top of the time and the resource that it takes to make those shoes. And this is called economic rent. All right? Because your shoes are popular, because they carry a particular desired brand, you're able to earn an additional portion of money simply because your product is boutique or exclusive or in high demand. And I was thinking about these principles, and I thought, is there anything better than this idea of rent? Is there anything better than being paid a premium, being paid beyond your salary for no additional time and no additional effort? And there is. It's called royalties. You know what royalties are? Royalties are when you do something once and you don't do it again, and yet you keep getting paid. We have another concept or another term to describe this, and that's called a passive income. When you go about working or investing in such a way that the money keeps coming in even after you stop working. Who would like a passive income? Yeah, now I get a response. You know, I kept thinking, is there anything better than this? Is there anything better than a passive income? Than working once and yet seeing those checks keep coming in? And there is. And it's the concept of privilege. Privilege is where you do nothing and yet you still get something. It's literally where you do nothing at all to earn something and yet you still get things. I remember one of the first holidays that Bianca and I went on as newlyweds was to the United States of America. And you know how in life there's this continuing of time and money, right? And when you're young, you typically have a lot of time and not much money. And as you get older, you tend to get more money and less time, right? Well, we were very much on this end of the spectrum with a lot of time and not much money. And so we decided that we were going to public transport most of our holiday in the United States. And one of the places we wanted to get to was Dallas. And we landed in Los Angeles and we saw some of the sights there. And our plan was to catch a bus to Dallas. Now, I don't know how good your geography is, but Dallas is about a 30-hour bus ride from Los Angeles. Like, we're talking epic bum. Like one bus ride, no stopping. It's about I looked it up, it's about the same distance from Bright to Townsville. This is a long bus journey, right? And we landed at LAX, the airport in Los Angeles. And we began to make our way toward downtown LA, which is where we had to catch this bus from. And we'd kind of hopped on and off buses. And we would made our way in the general direction of where we needed to go. But we were lost, and we were still in the suburbs of LA, not in downtown. And I remember standing at a bus stop and seeing this big metro bus pull up. And as the people got off in a hurry and got on in a hurry, I kind of poked my head in the driver's doorway and I said, "Is this the 34?" Well, the bus driver didn't even look at me. She just said, "No." I was like, "Oh." So I said, "Mate, we're totally lost. We're trying to find the 34. We need to get downtown to catch our bus. Do you have any idea where the 34 is, where I can find the 34? Well, as I began to talk a little bit more, she swiveled her head quite quickly and I could see a twinkle in her eye forming. And she said, "Where are y'all from?" I said, "Australia, mate." And then she began to jump into this monologue about, "Oh my goodness, my niece went to Australia. She said it's the most amazing place ever. She said people were so wonderful. They're so kind. She said, all I want to do is go to Australia. I'm driving this bus to save up. I just want to go to Australia." And then she said, "Hop on." And I was thinking to myself, hang on, didn't you say this wasn't the 34? So as I'm wrestling our suitcases up into the bus and we're sitting in the dicky seat across the aisle from the bus driver, before she closes the doors, she pulls out her little bus microphone. And she announces this: "Hey everybody, I just want you to let you know that we have some guests from Australia on our bus." I'm like, man, where is this going? She said, "They're lost." It's like, thanks. And they're trying to get downtown LA. So I just want to let you know, we're not going to take our normal route today. She said, "We're going to keep going down this road, and then we're going to turn right onto Union Avenue. We're going to follow that all the way down. Then we're going to turn left onto 3rd Street. Then we're going to follow 3rd Street all the way down until we get to downtown LA." She said, "And if you don't like that, get off." So a couple disgruntled people walked past us and frowned as they got off. But most of the other people kind of cheered, and she said, "Let's help out these guests from Australia." You know, having an LA bus driver completely deviate from the route that they're supposed to take, the route that they're paid to take, the route that paying customers expect them to take, in order to get us to our intended destination, that's called privilege. We did absolutely nothing to earn being taken to where we needed to go, other than the fact that we sounded like Australians, and I may have hammed it up a little bit when I saw it was helpful. Mate, every second word. But I hazard a guess that had our skin color been slightly different, or had our tone been different, had we not had an accent, had maybe we been Mexican immigrants or even fellow Americans, I dare say we would have been treated very differently. But only because this lady happened to love Australia and want to go to Australia, instead we experience favor. Instead, we experience privilege. Privilege, as Sean Ferguson puts it, is this clicker going to work? Oh no, it's turned off. Is this: unearned access to resources or social power that are only readily available to some people because of their social group membership. An advantage or immunity granted to or enjoyed by one societal group above and beyond the common advantage of all other groups. And there's lots of types of privilege. There's racial privilege. There's religious privilege, there's economic or class privilege, there's gender privilege, there's able-bodied privilege, there's citizenship privilege, and the list goes on. And this idea of privilege has become one of the most divisive things in our culture today. On the one hand, you have people at one end of the spectrum for who privilege is a bad thing. It represents something that they never had. It's the word associated with the never-ending hurdles they had to clamber over just to do things or participate in life in a way that privileged people never even have to think about. You know, I never forget when we were on safari in Zimbabwe. We were on a canoeing safari down the Zambezi River. And each member of our group had been paired with a local Zimbabwean guide. We were in twos. Someone who was an expert on the rapids and the wildlife. And I never forget, as we're paddling down this river, I'm chatting to my guide. His name was Tendai. And he says to me, "Matt, why Zimbabwe?" Now, let me ask you, because someone, Adam Lindsay, had the nerve to have a crack at my accent last week, despite that I had no voice and was dying. So was that okay? Because I've been practicing in front of the mirror and Google Translate for a week just so I wouldn't get ridiculed. So he said, "Matt, why Zimbabwe?" I said, "Well, why not? Like, you guys have elephants and lions and zebras and all this amazing landscape that we don't have in Australia. Like, we got beaches and sharks and sausages. And that's about it." Well, we got a bit more. And he said to me, "Oh, well, what else?" And so we started going through this list of things that, where else would I like to go? And I rattled off a few places. And then I turned the conversation. I said, "Well, what about you, Tendai? Where do you want to go?" And without even thinking, like it just came out, almost like a reaction, he said, "South Africa." I said, "South Africa?" See, you have to understand that South Africa borders Zimbabwe. It's a neighboring country. You can drive there in like 3 hours. And I said, a bit confused, "Why South Africa? Like, don't you want to go somewhere a little bit more exotic, maybe Italy or France or America or Australia? It's a pretty great place minus the sharks." He said, "Well, I can't travel anywhere outside of Africa." And I was a bit confused. I said, "Well, why not? Are you worried about flying? Like, you said you got 5 kids. I assume it would be pretty expensive to stick them on a plane. Like, is that the issue?" He said, "No. You see, every Western country in the world will not allow residents of Zimbabwe or Zambia or Botswana or Somalia or basically most of the African nations. They won't allow us to travel to their country. They won't grant us a visa unless we can show $100,000 in our bank account." And I just kind of looked at him. He said, "These countries are worried that if we holiday there and we can't show this kind of huge amount of money, that we'll refuse to leave and that we'll illegally seek asylum there." You know, I never forget how speechless I was. And I'm good at talking, right? I'm very good too at smoothing over awkward moments in conversation. But I had nothing. You see, I knew about this idea of privilege, but I'd always constrained it to the areas of wealth or education. I could hardly conceive that simply because I was born where I was born, that meant I had total freedom to travel the world. That I could literally visit any country I wanted to, and catch this, I could do it on credit card debt. And yet, here was Tendai, my fellow canoe companion, also a man created in the image of God, who through no fault of his own was precluded to traveling to about 10% of the globe simply because of his country of birth. It just didn't seem fair. And due to the seemingly unfair nature of privilege, or lack of privilege, people at this end of the spectrum deduce that privilege is therefore bad and it needs to be eradicated. At the other end of the spectrum, you have people, typically people with privilege, who view it more as a responsibility. That the only reason I am where I am, they say, is because I earned it. No benevolent patron of privilege did the 10 years of university study that I had to do to become the doctor or the architect or the psychologist that I am. I'm the one who worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week, just to get my business off the ground and to make it what it is today. No one gifted me anything. I scrimped and saved to buy that house. That's on me. And typically, people who have privilege argue that there's nothing such as privilege, but simply taking responsibility for your actions and for your future. And people at this end of the spectrum either feel one of two things. They either feel incredibly defensive at the thought that they have privilege, or they feel inescapably guilty because they realize they do, but they're not sure what to do with it. And this is the narrative that we find ourselves in. And the reality is that as the people of God gathered here in Bright, Australia, that we as a congregation entirely, if not the absolute vast majority, we have privilege. We all have a degree of affluence or freedom or power or connection to healthcare or education that gives us opportunity, that grants us access to things and places that 80% of the entire human race just don't get. Through no fault of their own, and neither because we've done anything to deserve it. That's called privilege. And I wonder what bubbles up in your heart this morning when I say that you have privilege. Is it guilt? Or is it a sense of defensiveness or entitlement? Or is it indignation and desire to eradicate this thing called privilege? Is it justice? Well, whatever the case, my desire this morning isn't to wade into the complex philosophical and political debate about the nature of privilege, whether it's inherently bad or the byproduct in part of being responsible for what we're given. Instead, my focus is on what is our response? What is Jesus' vision for you and I who find ourselves with privilege? So let's turn back to our passage this morning, as I think the Apostle Paul lays out a pretty compelling vision of how we're to respond to privilege. He says this: "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross." You see, the first thing I believe that we're called to do in our response to having privilege is humbly redirect it. Notice Paul's exhortation to the Philippians is that they are to take on the mindset of Christ. Verse 5 says, "Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position as a slave." You see, Jesus was humble. Despite literally being God himself, despite being justified at carrying himself with the title of King of Kings and Lord of Lords, which he is, despite being entitled to enjoying his status as creator of the universe, to enjoying some of the fruits of creator of the universe, he instead chooses to forgo that status. He chooses to relinquish his equality with God, and rather than using his privilege for his own advantage, he humbly redirects it for the sake of others, for the sake of you, for the sake of me. This, I believe, is part one of Jesus' vision for those of us with privilege, that we would humbly redirect it for the sake of others. Author John Dickson writes in his remarkable book on humility these words. He says, "Humility is the noble choice to forgo your status, to deploy your resource or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. More simply, you could say, the humble person is marked by a willingness to hold power in service of others. First, humility presupposes your dignity. True humility assumes the dignity or strength of the person possessing the virtue, which is why it should not be confused with having low self-esteem or being a doormat for others. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it is impossible to be humble in the real sense without a healthy sense of your own worth and abilities. Second, humility is willing. It's a choice. Otherwise, it's humiliation. Finally, humility is social. It's not a private act of self-deprecation, banishing proud thoughts, refusing to talk about your achievements, and so on. I would call this simple modesty. But humility is about redirecting your powers, whether physical, intellectual, financial, or structural, for the sake of others. And so the question Jesus would have for us this morning is, how are we redirecting the privilege we have for the sake of others? Not can we justify why we're not redirecting our privilege, or not can we point to someone else who has more privilege than us, but how are we, with the privilege that we have, with our degree of privilege, how are we redirecting that for the sake of others? How are we using the fact that we have a good chunk of spare time for the sake of others? How are we using the fact that we have positional power in our job or in our community for the sake of others? How are we using the fact that we are financially secure for the sake of others? You know, it doesn't matter ultimately whether these things were a gift or the byproduct of your hard work. If you have them, you have privilege. And the Apostle Paul's exhortation is the same. Take on the mindset of Christ and humbly redirect the privilege for the sake of others. The second part of responding to the privilege that we have in light of Jesus and the kingdom isn't simply just humbly redirecting it, but it's sacrificially expending it. In his chapter on privilege, John Tyson talks about the concept of game theory and its relationship to sacrifice and the gospel. Now, game theory, for those freaking out, is just a mathematical theory that talks about or suggests that the way players make decisions in a competitive framework. All right, I'll give you an example. If I eat 4 pieces of pie from a pie that only has 4 pieces, i.e. the whole pie, and I have been known to eat a whole pie, then the exact amount I consume becomes the exact deficit that others experience. Does that make sense? That is, if I eat 4 pieces, there's now 4 less pieces for anyone else to eat. I win, you lose. Win, lose. And given the competitive, self-focused nature of this framework, Society has looked for a better framework, a more moral framework to build upon. And as a result, what has become rampantly popular, particularly for religious people, is the concept of win-win. Win-win, the concept of dying to myself to follow Jesus just enough that it creates a positive outcome for someone else. In a win-win scenario, instead of me indulging in 4 pieces of pie at the expense of you getting nothing, I instead consume 2 and allow you to consume 2. And so there's a win-win. And I don't feel quite so guilty about eating my 2 pieces of pie, right? And this seems kind of reasonable on the surface, right? It seems to capture to a degree this idea of humbly redirecting some of our privilege. However, as Tyson points out, and I quote, even in our best moments of generosity, win-win really means I'll help right now if it works, but not if it costs me deeply. Isn't that true? I know that's true for me. You see, the problem with stopping at humbly redirecting some of our privilege, settling for a win-win, is that it's often, more often than not, a strategy of our heart to stop giving rather than to genuinely sacrificially give. A win-win is often more concerned with our excess, the portion of our time or our talent or our resource that we're prepared to go without, rather than being actually concerned with sacrificing for the sake of others. It's the opposite to the widow's mite, remember? The widow who gave 2 tiny cents. But she gave out of everything that she had, compared to the rich Pharisees who gave heaps, but it was out of their surplus. You know, Jesus' vision of how we respond to privilege isn't just to humbly redirect it for the sake of others. It isn't simply to get a win-win, that if it works and it doesn't cost me too much, then okay, I'll make it happen. No, his vision is actually, it's a lose-win, where I go about intentionally losing for the sake of others, where I become a slave or a servant for the sake of others, where I don't just humbly redirect a portion of my privilege, but I sacrificially expend it on behalf of others. I go out of my way to spend my privilege, to spend my power, to spend my connections, to spend my networks, to spend my education or my wealth or my freedom or my spare time on behalf of others at deep cost to myself. This is the ultimate vision of how we're called to respond to privilege. You know why? Because this is what Jesus role modeled, is it not? He didn't sit in heaven and go, oh, you know what? I'm going to humbly redirect just a little portion of my divine privilege. Maybe I'll just save a few people. Or maybe I'll come down to earth. Look, that's humiliating enough. I'm God, right? But I'm not going to let them trample over me. No, I'll show them who's boss. I'll do some zip-zap cool miracles, give them a chance, and if they don't, that's on them. He didn't do that, did he? He exhausted his privilege, his divine resource, his divine agency. He spent it on humanity. He didn't use it for his own advantage. He spent it on humanity. You know, Isaiah 58, 9 to 11. Israel are complaining to God because they're saying, look, we're holding up our part of the Abrahamic covenant. You know, we're doing the stuff that you asked. Why aren't you blessing us? Why aren't things going well? And God's pretty frustrated with him. He says, because actually you're just giving me lip service. You're actually still spending your money like the pagans. You're actually still engaging in life like the other nations around you. Yeah, you're ticking the box, but you're not actually sacrificially expending your privilege. And so he says to them in Isaiah 58, 9-11 this: if you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing finger and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness, and your night will become like the noonday. The Lord will guide you always. He will satisfy your needs in a sun-scorched land and will strengthen your frame. You will be like a well-watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. You see, God is saying to Israel, just as God is saying to us, that if we want our light to rise in the darkness, if we want our light to shine in bright, that if we want to be disciples that hear, well done, good and faithful servant, if we want to take our relationship seriously with Jesus, that if we want to not be tamed, if we don't want to become lukewarm, then we have to make sure that our sacrifice resists privilege. That our response to the privilege we have as affluent, Western, educated, free and prosperous Australians is that we not only humbly direct it to others, but we go about spending it, exhausting it, using it on behalf of others. That's being salt and light, right? That's being the light of the world. And you know what? The challenge is this, and I don't speak this out of comfort. This is something I've wrestled with myself all week in the deepest parts of my heart. But my challenge is this morning that there are people here who have so much money they don't actually know what to do with it. It just sits in bank accounts doing nothing. And I believe God would say to you, how are you using your financial privilege? How are you expending it? How are you exhausting that privilege on behalf of others? How are you using it to build the kingdom, to build my church? I believe he would say, you know what? There are people here that have so much free time that they're thinking about taking up a fourth, a fifth, a sixth hobby. God would say, what are you doing to expend that privilege on behalf of others? What are you doing to exhaust that privilege in building my kingdom? That there are people here with talents, with capacity to do things. And you're just sitting there comfy, and I get it. But I believe God's saying this morning, what are you doing with the talents that I've given you? What are you doing with the privilege that I've given you? Are you exhausting it on behalf of others? Or are you using it for your own advantage? You know, friends, I deeply believe that the light of Bright Church of Christ can absolutely rise in the darkness. But it doesn't happen when 3 or 4 or 5 people exhaust their privilege, spend their privilege on behalf of others. It happens when we as a community exhaust whatever privilege God's given you. And honestly, if you're sitting here, it's off the charts privilege compared to most of the world. So the invitation this morning for me and for you is, how are we going to exhaust the privilege that God has given us? Are we going to use it for our own advantage? Or are we going to take the role model of Christ and we're going to use that agency, use that wealth, use that spare time, use those talents, use that freedom and spend it on behalf of others? Let's pray. Father God, I'm so deeply convicted that so much of what I have and so much of what I do is all about my own advantage. It's more often than not setting aside a tiny little bit to create a win-win and not actually spending what you've given me on behalf of others. And God, I pray right now as you're stirring in this room that you would lay it on people's hearts, that you would give us the courage, God, to hear the challenge, to follow your lead, where you didn't keep your divine privileges and agencies for yourself, but you spent them on our behalf. And that, God, we would do the same and spend that privilege on behalf of others. Oh God, I pray we would not be too quick to walk away from this challenge, to dismiss it. That, Father God, you would really stir in our hearts. That we would leave this place different